of the Proverbs. So begin with me, if you will, in Proverbs chapter 11, and listen to what God is saying here. It's the two sides of our coin of life. Listen to what he's saying. A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is His delight. We should be people that focus on the things that delight God, that make God happy, the things that He notices. And in the big scheme of things, in life itself, I don't know where this falls if you contrast a just balance to someone who gives their life as a martyr for Christ. I don't know where in the balance of God as He looks upon things that falls, but I do know one thing that God says very clearly, that it brings Him delight. And He talks about that a lot. And in my private reading and my private study, and I love to listen and read the things that delight God. On the other hand, God said a false balance is an abomination to Him. I don't know that we hear how strongly God feels about that. An abomination, it means that God is disgusted with this. It brings disgust to God. It's not just something that troubles God, but it sickens God whenever He sees a dishonest scale. And He doesn't just say that one time. He's going to say that over and over again through the old law. And then Jesus, whenever He's talking about the Sermon on the Mount, is actually going to build a lot of what He says toward the end around the concept of a good balance and a false balance. But listen to what He's saying here. The daily living, the daily pressure that we feel. And it's there. It's there. As costs continue to go up. You know, I never would have thought that we would talk about the good old days when you could buy a Snicker bar for a nickel. And or when Judy and I got married, we were paying 16 cents a gallon for gasoline. And how really we were shocked. We were shocked when gasoline got up to 21 cents a gallon. And we were starting to measure our own trips, where we would go, even if we were going to go across town by 21 cents a gallon. And then we were, in that time there were even delights. We were delighted whenever the gas companies would have a gas war. There are no gas wars anymore. But whenever Conoco and Phillips and it was Humble Oil back then, now Exxon and Texaco, when they would be trying to attract new customers, and there'd be a gas station almost on every corner, and over here the one company would lower their price to 20 cents a gallon, and so the company across the street would lower theirs to 19, and in that war, when it was 21 cents a gallon normally, they got down to 19, and there's a line of cars over there, for 2 cents a gallon. And I look back on that, and those days will never come back. And we feel it. We feel the strain of that. And to just imagine, I don't know, some of you who have mathematical minds could tell me what percentage that is to have gone from 16 cents a gallon to $4 a gallon. How many hundreds of percent that is. And I'm sure that some of you will tell me after service. But we feel it. We feel the daily pressure of life. We feel the living. And a joyous time of year is coming when people exchange gifts, and we all look forward to that. But then at the same time, we look at the cost of it. And people are saying, how can we get by? How can we manage? What is life going to be like next year if things don't get better? And of course, when we're talking about things getting better, we're talking about often about things more affordable. It just never ceases to end. And the pressure's there, not just to cut corners, but the temptation will be there to cheat. To cheat. It's there. To cheat. To not be honest. And we ask so many questions now. If you're buying a used car, you talk to some people that are selling their cars on Craigslist, and you wonder why they're selling them. It sounds like the car is just perfect, and then you buy it and you find out that it's not. Maybe they weren't telling you the truth. The cheating that happens in our world. God says we're to be different. Go to Proverbs chapter 16 and listen to what God says. A just balance and scales belong to the Lord. Do you want to know something that comes from the presence of God? It's not just angels that are in His presence or those saints who have passed on, but God said in His presence also is just scales and accurate measurements. He said that kind of honesty is what God has chosen to describe Himself. He said, this is part of me. And He says, all the weights of the bag are His concern. Now, we don't carry around weights and measures anymore. We don't have our bag of weights to measure things out like they did even in the frontier days of America and still do in some places in the world. I was talking about being in India this morning, and I mentioned it, and I remember one of the trips, we see the scales everywhere we go, and we were driving through some vineyards, and the white grapes were just almost bursting on the vines, and we stopped to buy some at a little roadside stand, and we were eager to get these grapes, and Judy was asking, well, do we have enough bleach left? And I would always pack a bottle of bleach, and a little bottle of bleach, and maybe a Listerine bottle, because they were glass and it was harder to break them. So I said, yes, we've got some, because we'd mix about a teaspoon of bleach in a gallon of water, and it would purify the water, and we could wash our fruit and stuff in it, and we didn't have to be afraid of picking up something. And so we stopped to get the grapes, and I mean, and right now, I don't know how your mouth is doing, but mine is tasting those grapes. I mean, it's just, and that's the way I was standing there looking at the grapes, and they were just, you could tell they were ready to be eaten. And then I thought about the warnings I had received about, the measuring, and they had the scale that looks much like the one that's right here, and a universal scale there where the balance is, and the two little pans, and there's a little halo that the chain's held on, and you'd put the pans in there depending on how big the thing was. And I thought, okay, and the man measured it out, and then when he took the grapes out, I switched the pans. I took the pan from this side and I put it on the other side, and then I said, do it again. And he just smiled real big, and he reduced the price by half. Well, unless you really look at the pan, you couldn't tell that one pan was thicker, and it would weigh a lot more. And so he sees this fellow that obviously I'm not a local, and so he's going to take advantage. But he knew he was caught. He knew he was caught, and I thought, it's sad. It's a terrible commentary on human thinking to look for ways to take advantage of others. But I tell you, sadly, there are times when you don't even have to leave this church building before you'll find it. Listen to what God is saying. He says, all the weights of the bag are His concern. That the God of heaven and earth, that rules over everything, that created everything, and all of the order in all that He has made, that He notices honest scales. And they bring a smile to His face. And that He's concerned about any time anyone, anywhere, uses dishonest measures. Wow. All of the weights of the bag are his concern. Go to chapter 20 and verse 10, and he comes back to that original thought tonight. He says, differing weights and differing measures, both of them are abominable to the Lord. You know what God puts in the category of abominations? If you want to know how strongly this disgusts God, you want to know what God puts in the list of abominations? Idol worship, especially to gods like Molech, where the people were offering their children, and the Old Testament will often refer to it as passing through the fire, where they would put their hand in that, we've talked about it, this great big brass idol that they built right outside the gates of Jerusalem, right outside the wall. And this was a giant, bigger than the 90-foot idol that Nebuchadnezzar had made. And here is this giant Buddha-like God, but where his big belly would be, they've hollowed it out and they have fire there. And both of his arms are on hinges. And they required the people to bring one of their children and put it in the hand of Molech, and then the priest of Molech would turn the arm over the fire, passing that child through the fire. That's what finally brought the judgment of God against the kingdom of Israel and Manasseh. Whenever God finally said nothing is going to deter his judgment. It's going to happen regardless. Manasseh not only insisted that the people of God, of Judah, I said Israel, but including of Judah, not only did he insist that the people offer their children to Molech, but he himself offered his children to Molech. Most wicked king that ever lived. 55 years he served as king. Now he is both an example of the most abominable, and God uses that word, abominable king, and also an example of God's unending mercy and his forgiveness, because when God brought Manasseh off of the throne and Manasseh repented, you see, sometimes we read that word and we go, well, it's an easy thing to repent. Well, evidently not. When Manasseh repented, God restored him to the throne. Amazing. But here's an abomination, that you would make your children pass through the fire. And if that child died in the hand of Molech, then the priest said, your family's all right. You're in good standing with Molech. You're a Molechite, or whatever they wanted to call themselves, for the rest of your life. Everything's fine. But if in its dying that child crawled out of the hand and fell into the fire, you had to offer another. And another, and another, until one of them finally stayed in his hand. God says that is an abomination. And dishonest scales, what are they, Father? An abomination. Doesn't blink. I mean, with God, there is no shadow of turning. There is no difference. When God says something, that's the category that he puts dishonesty in. Wow. Homosexuality. Politically a hot topic today. God puts homosexuality in that column. An abomination. A false witness. A false witness. Now, according to God's law, a false witness should have been something that eliminated itself, because God said that if you offered a false witness before Him, if you were paid, or even if you just didn't like the person, and you go and you testify in court, and what you're testifying about is a lie, and what you're wanting is for whoever this is to be punished or maybe even put to death, God said that a false witness, once they were found out, whatever the charge was, whatever the penalty was against the person they were offering false witness, is what would happen to them. So that should have, just by virtue of of the law itself that should have eliminated all false witnesses, because if they were testifying to get someone put to death, then they should have been put to death. But obviously they weren't, because there were also corrupt judges and corrupt priests. And you know what category God puts corrupt judges and corrupt priests in? An abomination. He says they are an abomination to the Lord. And I read those things, and I read about idols, and I read about homosexuality, and not only the people out of Romans chapter 1, it doesn't use that word there, but it's very strong and implies the same thing. In Romans chapter 1 it says not only those that practice such things, but those that allow them. Those that pave the way, those that open the door for them. Maybe they don't participate themselves, but they allow them. You look at things like that, and then you look at false scales, and here I'm standing beside a dusty road in India in the heat of the day, and I'm see, sometimes it's hard for us to equate that, isn't it? Because this man's, what do we say about this man? He's a poor man to start with. Probably not, because he owns a vineyard. But he's just wanting to make more. We say, well, this is a poor man trying to make a living. And this one over here is totally corrupting and perverting the way of God. But God brings these two together. And He says a false balance is an abomination before Him. Interesting. I worked with a man that was like that. In many ways, he took me as a brother. We worked together for 6 years while I was in high school and college, painting for a company. He was a hard worker, and he taught me a lot of good things. He was 10 years older, and he took good care of me. He liked me, but he didn't serve God. He restored old cars. And he loved to race cars. And he had the state record of the fastest stock car in the state of Texas. And that record may still stand because he was so good at that. He could take parts from a wrecking yard and build something that people would pay thousands of dollars for. In fact, he did that often. His car of choice was a 55 two-door post. It wasn't a two-door hardtop. He wanted a two-door post because in racing he always thought, something could happen. Someone could run into him and roll his car, and he didn't want the hardtop because it would squash in easier. He wanted the two-door post, and so it became a legend. And he called his car Old White, and he painted it white, and the inside windows were tinted, and the seats back in our day, it wouldn't mean nothing to you today, young people, but he had leather rolled and pleated. I mean, it wasn't just leather seats; it was tucked and pleated, and it was something. And I think while I worked for him, he sold that car maybe 5 or 6 times. Or at least one that looked a whole lot like it. He would paint another one it was identical. He'd have the inside done and it was identical, but he would put some other motor in. He would let them drive his car. And it would do everything but say yes, sir, and no, ma'am. And once you drove it, you had to have it. And he would say, well, you can pick it up, bring the cash and you can pick it up. And he'd always set it like 3 or 4 days off, and he'd change the motor. And he'd change the transmission. And I knew when that was going to happen because he'd say, we're going to eat lunch at the house today. We're not going to go to the cafe. He said, I've got a guy coming over going to pick up Old White. And I said, again? And he said, I know you don't want to be part of it, so you go ahead and eat a sandwich in the house with Sue. And he said, I'll be out here doing it. The people would come back to him and say, something's wrong with this car because I can't get it to do all the stuff that you got it to do. And he said, well, keep practicing. And I liked Marty. I really did. But God said he's in the same spot that the priests of Molech are in. And see, there's times in our worldly mind that's hard to bring those together. But God does. Are we listening to Him? Differing weights and differing measures, both of them are an abomination to the Lord. Let's go to the balance, the weights, the scales of measure. However you want to refer to it, God's got it all covered. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 19. Back in the book of law that really applied to the priest, because the priests were responsible for seeing that the law was taught, and in many ways seeing that it was executed, that people would bring issues before the priest. And listen to what he says, beginning in verse 35. He said, "You shall do no wrong in judgment." Well, we'd say okay to that. But then he goes on. "In measurement of weight or capacity, you shall have just balance, just weights, just ephah." That's the dry measurement. We don't use that word today. It's almost a bushel, but we don't. In fact, we would have a hard time today for someone to say, "All right, this is a bushel. This is a bushel." And because we don't use that terminology today. But he's saying, in your dry measurements, you shall have just weights, and just as in your hin, that's a liquid measurement. Now, we use a gallon, but our friends back to the east, they use more than that for their gallon. A British gallon is a little bit more than an American gallon. But what God says, whatever you want to call it, He says, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall thus observe all of my statutes and all of my ordinances to do them. I am the Lord." And He comes back and He says that to the priest. That's who we are, not just me. That's who we are. We are a priesthood of believers. And He has to say this to them. Or the book of Deuteronomy, we find God's judgment again. Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 13. He said, "You shall not have in your bag differing weights, a large and a small. You shall not have in your house differing measures, a large and a small. You shall have full and just weight. You shall have full and just measure. That your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you." Sounds like the first commandment with promise. Do you remember what that was? Any of our young people? Just our young people this evening. First commandment with promise. What was it? Bible class teachers, take note of this. The first commandment with promise. In the 10 Commandments, God said, "You shall honor your father and your mother," which is the first commandment with promise. See, God even identifies it there. So that was kind of an easy question for me to ask. First commandment with promise. And what was that promise? That you'll live long in the land that the Lord your God gives you. Now, all of us parents, we know that because we've used that. You shall honor your father and your mother. We've used that. It's frustrated a lot of adults because some parents are not worthy of honor. That's true. But God doesn't say worth is in there at all. He's talking about the attitude of the person that's to show it. He said, "You show honor regardless." Regardless. He's not talking about the worth there. He's talking about an attitude in your heart, in the position that they're in. But listen to what he says next. He says that your days may be long in the land which the Lord your God gives you. For everyone who does these things, everyone who acts unjustly, is an abomination to the Lord. You want to be put in that category with all of Molech? You want to be put in the category of those that shed innocent blood is another abomination to the Lord? God puts it there. This is serious, and this really needs to describe us, and it means that there are times when we have to speak up. Ezekiel chapter 45 and verse 10, he very simply says, "You shall have just balances." Make sure that you have accurate scales. Make sure that you fix the scales. Make sure that you practice honesty. Well, I'm not accusing anyone tonight. And the truth is, God isn't either. He's laying this out, and He's saying, here is how it is. Micah chapter 6. Let's go to Micah chapter 6 in the Old Testament. Micah chapter 6, and he begins in verse 6, and he sets the stage for what we're going to talk about. Micah chapter 6, beginning in verse 6, he said, with what shall I come to the Lord and bow myself before the God on high? Shall I come to Him with burnt offerings, with yearling calves? Does the Lord take delight in thousands of rams? You see, he's asking that question again. Delight. What delights the Lord? So that's important. That should get our attention again. Does the Lord take delight in thousands of ram, in 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I present my firstborn for my rebellious acts? And there, not just in prophecy pointing to the coming of Jesus or in what Abraham did, but also what the followers of Molech were doing in trying to please their God. He said, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? So how does that fit in with my life? How does the Lord begin to explain that? Doing justice, walking humbly, and showing kindness. How does that translate? He asks the question in verse 10. He says, is there yet a wicked man in the house, along with the treasures of wickedness? He's saying, how far have you removed wickedness from your life? What is your house that he's talking about? He's talking about your life. Your life. Just like the Lord is when He talks about our house, the house of this body, when He's saying that this body's a tent, and there's coming a time when I'm going to roll up my tent. The house of this body is not a permanent structure. And He said, is there yet a wicked man in the house? Have you left that man in there? Or have you done what God says through Peter, that you are to remove all malice and all wickedness? Right in the middle of talking about us becoming newborn babes, and we become newborn babes as we're born according to the Word of God, and we've purified our souls in doing that. So in purifying our souls, you've got to get rid of all the wickedness. You've got to get rid of all the malice. And then he goes on to say, as newborn babes desire the sincere milk of the Word, that they may grow thereby. We talked about growth this morning. That's so important. And this all fits together. Is there yet a wicked man in the house, along with treasures of wickedness? And a short measure that is cursed? Have you held on to just a little bit of it? Have you held on to just a little bit of it? Listen to the way he's saying this. Is there yet a wicked man in the house, along with the treasures of wickedness, and a short measure that is cursed? Well, you've got rid of the big scales. The big things. You've got rid of the. But you hold on. You hadn't got rid of it. In verse 11, he says, "Can I justify wicked scales in a bag of deceptive weights?" No. He said, not even a little bit. Not even a little bit. He's saying, get rid of all of it. He's saying, check your scales. Check your scales and compare. A little scale, no. Deceptive weights, no, they're not there. Short measure, no. Now let's go to the Jesus Sermon on the Mount, and our lesson is almost over. Listen to what he says. Matthew chapter 7. That's what he's talking about. Very same words if we go back over to the Hebrew and then we come into the Greek, and especially if you go backwards and you look at the Hebrew and you see the meaning of the Hebrew terminology that's there, you come into the Greek and it comes to life. I wish that in some ways I had the brain of our brother John Kaufman. Because he's got all those languages right there, and there's times whenever he's speaking English, but he's thinking Hebrew, and he's speaking Greek, but he's thinking English, and he brings all of those together, and that's really one of the things I admire about J.P. Jones's classes, because he brings all of that into English. He doesn't just say it in the Hebrew, but he brings it into English, and he wouldn't tell you about this, but I will. He takes classes online. And he studies at night, and he studies whenever he can, and he'll set up his time so he can actually go online live and talk to some of these rabbis that are teaching from Jerusalem. And I'm going, God bless you for doing that extra digging and then sharing that with us. It makes his classes come alive whenever he's doing that. But listen to what Jesus is saying, and listen with the ears that we've already prepared tonight, because we've been back over in the Old Testament. And you see, Jesus is the Word, whether we're in the Old Testament or the New. But listen to with the ears that we've already heard tonight. He says, "Do not judge, lest you be judged. For in the way that you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you." Application. "And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Judge not that you be not judged." He's talking about the way that we measure life, the way that we measure things, the way that we judge circumstances. And he comes back, and it really comes to life when we look back at that witness, that false witness that is an abomination to the Lord. That false witness that'll get up and not only he lies about someone else, and he says, "Yes, I saw them. That's the one, and he's deserving of murder." And God's law says, because of his false testimony, that he deserves murder. Regardless of what happens to this man, no, if he's acquitted or if he's sentenced to death, that this man should pay because he has been the false witness. And God says, through Jesus, be careful how you measure people. Be careful how you judge people, because the judgment that you use against others will be used against you. It's serious, isn't it? That he's not saying don't just stop and don't ever judge anymore. See, we're quick to point that out. That we're not judging the color of the leaves. We're fruit inspectors, and we're quick to point that. And yes, that is true. But even be careful then. First, make sure that your weights and measures in judgment, make sure that you're judging everyone by the yardstick that God gives, and not just by a 12-inch ruler that you might want to judge people by. Careful. Be real careful with this one. You choose, see? Really, you do. You choose. You choose the way that you deal with life and the measurement, and I mean, you choose. But you're also choosing. See, this morning we talked about the power that you have to actually veto God. You know, that God wants to come and live in you. He wants to be in you. The Spirit wants to be in you. Jesus wants to be in you. But you decide whether He comes in or not, because you can say no. You can put a sign on your door before Jesus ever knocks on it and say, "No solicitors." And that's it, you know. That's it. You actually veto God, because God wants to save you. Tonight, you get to choose judgment. You get to decide tonight. You decide by the way that you live how you will be judged before God. Wow. It makes a difference in the little things in my life. And Scott, the thing that bothers me about people driving is when they drift. I don't know what they call it. Maybe they call it drifting. You know, you're turning left, and there's a left lane there for you to turn into, and that's fine. They teach you in the book of driving that you're to turn into the nearest lane, but yet yet people will not only turn into that lane, but they'll turn into the next lane. And it seems like, all right, we could probably live with that, but what if there's 3 lanes there to choose from, and they don't turn into the lane, they turn, and that bothers me. And I really have to work on myself. In fact, you're supposed to signal before you change lanes, and I'm going, they didn't signal. But yet, I've had, I'll be honest, Mike. I was in defensive driving class because I got a ticket. So that tells you that I wasn't following all the rules, doesn't it? Yeah, okay, I've admitted that. And the instructor who was a retired policeman, he said, he said, the truth is, even you in the class, and obviously us in the class, he said, if I followed one of you for about 10 blocks, I would probably be able to write a citation. I'm going, really? Really? Not me? And then I got to thinking about that while I was driving, and even me. Oh, be careful. So it's not the great big things of life, but it's also the little bitty things. Do you realize how much this would take away the stress in our life if we just practice this? Everybody judged by the same standard. And obviously you want mercy and you want fairness for yourself. Can we show it to others? So you choose the weights, the measures. You choose your judgment. That's what God said. That's what Jesus said. By the judgment you judge, you will also be judged. Be careful with this. And if you need help with it, there's no better time than tonight to get it. Whatever you need, come right now while we stand and sing.
From the source above, and He bids us all freely drink. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me, thirsty soul. Hear the well.